Good morning everyone, I guess, and welcome back to another video. And today we're going to take a look at this here GTX 580 Lightning and compare it to my GTX 580 DirectCUII. And I'm gonna talk a bit about my sort of experiments with this card and my considerations to run it on dry ice. Because this card has a couple things that it does great, and there's a couple things that this does not as great as the DirectCUII, which I'm pretty sure I'm going to run the DirectCUII on dry ice. I'm not so sure about this one, and I'm going to explain why. So, to introduce this card, this is my second GTX 580 Lightning. I call it the sketchy Lightning or also the dodgy Lightning because this one has a couple of things that, are sketchy or dodgy. And actually this is not really a Lightning, because what this actually is, according to MSI, is a GTX 580 Twin Throzer 3 Power Edition. Now essentially what that means is, yeah, it's a Lightning, but the BIOS it has is slightly more locked down, and it does not have the prod lasers that a normal Lightning would have. It comes with these pads empty. You can see I added some capacitors of my own to rectify that, which I don't think these on memory helped, and this one I also added. I don't think these did anything. These 9 capacitors on the core, they helped the card at least at low voltage overclocking. I don't think they did much for high voltage overclocking. But with like the stock heatsink and stock voltage, this card now runs 986 megahertz, which for like 1.15 volts, that's pretty good if you ask me, especially on the stock heatsink, because like this card has a rather good stock heatsink, like much better than a lot of other cards, but it's still not that great because you're stuck using the IHS. So yeah, I think that's pretty good. And like if you overvolt it, I think you can do 1 GHz on the stock heatsink pretty easily. Which that's not always possible. Like I think reaching 1 GHz on like the stock heatsink for GTX 580s is pretty rare. So like you need a very good core and also like a pretty good PCB for that. Both of the things are true on this card. This is actually my best GTX 580 core. I have so far managed to run this at 1095 megahertz, so painfully close to 1.1 gigahertz, but not quite. And I did that at 1.45 volts behind the core. And yeah. And yeah, I think we should get into some of the, basically just get into what the card does great and what it doesn't. And first, I think let's get into the reason why I call it the sketchy 580 Lightning. So this has 2 main issues. The first issue is that this card, usually with the majority of cooling solutions, does not work. Like straight up doesn't work. It artifacts and not installs the driver, like, and as if it basically it shows the typical symptoms of, yeah, this core needs to be heat gunned, but actually this is not true for this card. So what happens on this card is if you do not give it enough mounting pressure, you get that artifacting. Specifically, the card needs mounting pressure in the 4 corners of the die substrate. And usually you only achieve that by using the IHS, because then the IHS presses down in those 4 corners and you get your mounting pressure and the card works. Of course, using the IHS is thermally a very big bottleneck. So you would prefer to run the card direct die. I have actually managed to do that because, as it turns out, the freeze mod water block I use has enough mounting pressure. The card works with that block. The old water block I had before actually didn't work with this card dealer did, but the freeze mod block I have does work. So I'm quite happy about that, because I did run it with the IHS before, because I wasn't expecting it to work. I just kind of tested it and then was very happy that it worked. And with the IHS at like cold ambient, this thing ran 52 degrees, and without the IHS at normal, actually warm ambient, like yesterday was pretty warm, it ran 37 degrees, and that was at higher voltage than the 52 degrees run. So yeah, removing the IHS on these cards is very, very, very helpful. So yeah, but that is something that happens with this card a lot. Luckily, my water block does not need the IHS. The other sketchy part about this is, you see these two inductors are marked, because you can't see it because of the heatsink, but there's actually no phases there. This Lightning does not have a 12 phase, it has a 10 phase, because this card had two faulty MOSFETs, and I had to remove them because I don't have any spare international rectifier direct FETs, so I could just remove them. I still think that even as a 10 phase, I think this VRM is still plenty. I ran at 1.45 volts, and this heatsink is not very substantial. It was getting very hot, and it just didn't care. It ran completely fine. So I don't think this being a 10 phase is that big of an issue. It might become an issue on like liquid nitrogen, but I think for like ambient and dry ice, this should be fine. Yeah, and yeah, it's a 10 phase. That's basically the thing. Like, this VRM is 2/12 or like 1/6 less powerful than a normal GTX 580 Lightning. But yeah, I mean, it's still 10 phases using international rectifier direct FETs. It's, as long as you keep these MOSFETs cool, they have a ton of continuous drain current, and I think I'm just gonna go find some thermal tape and some little like RAM heatsinks and just tape this on here, and that should help. I just need to find these, because I don't have many left, and most of them I found have like glue stuck to the lower side of them, which makes them hard to glue on, and I can't really get that glue off. So yeah. So those are the dodgy parts about the card. Now the very good part about this card is, well, again, this is my best core. This is like the highest I've ever pushed a GTX 580, just generally a GTX 580. Not the highest I've pushed a GF 110. My 560 Ti 448, I think I did run 1100 on. A 580 not, because like a 580 has... is it? Well, it's like 75-ish cores more? No, less than that. Like, a 580 has more cores. Like, the core has more things in it, and it does produce more heat. And I think that's a factor. So yeah. But, I mean, it's doing pretty well, in my opinion. And yeah. So the other thing that this card does really well is just the PCB itself, like the output filter. Like, even without the capacitors added, this is an insane output filter. Like, you have all of these, then on the back you have all of these, and now I've added all of these capacitors, and this is memory, actually. This is just an insane output filter. Like, I mean, the DirectCUII also has a really good output filter, and I think with these CAN types, the DirectCUII actually has more overall capacity. But these CAN type capacitors are like electrically inferior to like these multi-layer ceramics and SMD polymer capacitors, which the DirectCUII has less of. Though that said, the DirectCUII has a protlizer directly behind the core, which, as I've said, this card comes without. And these protligers are actually meant to be directly behind the core, not like at your VRM, because they are most effective directly behind the core. And I think that actually helps the DirectCUII a lot, because if I remember correctly, the DirectCUII used to be very popular for extreme overclocking. I think even more so than this card. Even though this is like meant for extreme overclocking, and the DirectCUII is not technically meant for it, because ASUS also had a GTX 580 matrix, which is meant for extreme overclocking. But those seem to be rather rare, and the DirectCUII seems just as capable, so yeah. And then the last thing this does really well is just basically, yeah, it's like meant for extreme overclocking, so it has a couple features that are very helpful. The most helpful feature, in my opinion, is that this card is incredibly easy to volt mod. Because you don't get datasheets for at least the vCore and the memory controller. But that's actually not an issue, because MSI literally just marks the part for you that you need to solder your potentiometer in parallel with. It should be here. You see that little marking that says VR ready? Come on, focus camera. And it has a little pointer that points to one of those resistors. Yeah, you just solder your potentiometer in parallel with that, and that's how you get more voltage. And the same is true for memory and core, which is where this potentiometer is soldered to. This is a 500 kilo ohm potentiometer, by the way, if you want the value I used. Memory and PAX I do not have volt modded. Memory because you can change memory voltage in software on this card, and you also have these switches, which if you flick these, they give you a couple extra millivolts offset on your voltage, and I've just flipped that for memory, and I can basically go like to 1.75 volts. That's enough. I'm not gonna bother to volt mod memory. And PAX, you actually actively want to avoid volt modding for more voltage, because like usually PAX voltage is not very interesting. Like it doesn't really do anything unless sometimes in liquid nitrogen it can help with cold bugs. On Fermi, this voltage is actually pretty important for overclocking, because undervolting this does help you with core stability. Not just can help you, it, in my experience, actively always does help you with core stability. And I've asked around, and basically you want to keep this voltage at 1.015 volts, and stock is like, I think, above 1.1 volts. So you do want to undervolt this by like about 100 millivolts, which you can do in software with this card. You cannot do that with the DirectCUII. So having software voltage control for core, memory, and PAX for this card is very helpful. But there's a thing, because the PAX voltage on this card actually changes under load. So on idle, with minus 100 millivolts, it's at 996 millivolts, which that's fine, that's low enough. But under load, it's actually at 1.05 volts, about 35 millivolts too high. So I will still need to volt mod this. Basically what I'm gonna do is just a reverse volt mod. Like, to get more voltage, you wire something from feedback to ground. So to get less voltage, you wire something from feedback to the output. That's how you get less voltage. So I'm still need to, like, this is the IC that creates PAX voltage, probably the... Basically, whenever I see this package, the feedback pin is usually pin number 6. But I'm gonna try to look up the datasheet for this. Then I'm gonna find whatever resistors connected to that between feedback and output. And then I'm just gonna put a potentiometer in parallel with that, and then I can get my PAX undervolted. That might bring this to 1100 actually. Yeah. So those are the things that this does great. So like, the corners is pretty good. This, just being a Lightning, has some very nice quality of life features. And yeah, basically I like the quality of life features both. Is about the PCB and the undervoltage and just volt mod support. With the, like the DirectCUII PCB, yeah, like you only have normal core voltage control as you have on every 580, and there's no really help they give you with volt modding the PCB. You have to find where to volt mod your things online, which, like, I got my, like, you also don't get a datasheet for the controllers on this card. Basically, I got my volt mod hookup points from someone who got a dead card and turn this into an ePower. And they've outmodded it as well. So I'm just showing it to you now, so you don't have to look for that. So yeah. And let's get into the things that this does not as well. Which, well, basically is the dodginess I've already talked about. Like, this card is just not as convenient to work with as the DirectCUII. The DirectCUII is very reliable. This one, because of those sketchy things, is not as reliable, and also just MSI cards in general for some reason. Actually, it was only on my old motherboard. The new motherboard I have in my test bench actually was very reliable. I haven't run into that issue yet. But on my old motherboard, for some reason, MSI cards just didn't work sometimes. And you have to like take them out of the PCI Express slot, plug them into a different PCI Express slot, do that a couple times, and then they would eventually work again. Which I guess doesn't happen anymore with the new motherboard I have. It's just like I still remember that, and it was very annoying. So, yeah. But basically the biggest downside to this card is actually the memory. And not just the silicon lottery I got for the memory, they're actually the memory chips I got on this itself. So both of these cards are Samsung based, but they're not using the same memory chips. Because this one is using Samsung G-Die. So you see before the dash there's a G. And Samsung G-Die, basically it's great for like out-of-the-box overclocking, like with the stock heatsink and in the like lower voltage regions. Samsung G-Die is actually great because it just clocks higher out of the box. But once you strap like more powerful cooling to the card and like get voltage control for memory, Samsung G-Die basically falls behind the Samsung E-Die that's on the DirectCUII. So you see there's an E here before the dash. Because G-Die does clock higher out of the box, but there's not really much you can do to improve that. Whereas on E-Die there's actually two ways to improve that. Because E-Die has cold scaling, so it gets more stable with cold, and it has voltage scaling, so it gets more stable if you overvolt it. Whereas G-Die actually gets worse if you cool it down. So there might be a point where it rolls over if you go like sub-zero, but for ambient temperatures, this likes to be hot. Like, this is actually a card, I literally took a hairdryer and heated up the memory chips, and they scaled about 100 megahertz. So it's not just margin of error, it's like, yeah, they scale with heat. They do roll over at some point, like basically at the point where it's hard to touch them, which I think is like 60 degrees. At that point it starts to hurt to touch things. That's where they roll over, that's where they get worse again. But yeah, like they basically like to be hot. Which, if you have a water block strapped to the card, because the water block does not just cool the die, it also means that there's less heat from the die traveling into the PCB and the memory chips. Basically, the memory chips run pretty cool if you have a water block on this card, especially also because this PCB is just very big. So even the PCB itself acts as a heatsink here. So yeah, the memory chips on this card run pretty cool. And because they are G-Die, they're not very happy about that. So yeah, especially if I would take this on dry ice, I would have to hope that, well, they roll over at some point if you take them cold enough and begin to scale again. But like, there's no guarantee that's gonna happen. So running this on dry ice might actually just be very, very bad, because like the memory might suck a lot. Whereas the DirectCUII, like, yeah, this maxes out the memory slider in MSI Afterburner. And you don't even need to do a lot for that. Just overvolt it and then like strap a water block to the core. The result, like the indirect cooling the memory gets because of that's enough. Like, you can max the 2605 memory slider in MSI Afterburner. You can go high in Precision X, but coincidentally 2605 is exactly where these chips max for like ambient overclocking. so I haven't bothered with Precision X yet. But yeah, like this does 2605. This is basically stuck at 2400, unless if you just run the card a couple runs in Firestrike, the memory chips do heat up a bit just from doing stuff. Then you can run like 2475. But you can't get to 2500 without like actively heating them up with like a hairdryer. If you heat them up with the hairdryer like a lot, I think you can actually get to 2575, so pretty close to the E-die chips. But yeah, I think like you do have to actively like point a hairdryer to this before every run you do, which is very annoying. And again, like if you put this on dry ice, like it's gonna get very cold in this area, and the memory chips will probably not like that. Like again, there could be a point where they roll over, but there's no guarantee for that, so yeah. And then also these do not have voltage scaling. Like E-die has voltage scaling, these do not. They get like from like I think 1.55 volts is stock for this card, and I went up like all the way to 1.75 volts. So 200 millivolts over voltage. And these things scale like 50 megahertz. Now you would say, okay, they just have very bad voltage scaling, but I do have a suspicion that they're not actually scaling from the voltage, they're just scaling from the extra heat that pumping the voltage into the chips causes. Because they get very slightly warmer from just running more voltage into them. And I think that's actually why they scale, because like they like to be warm. So I don't think it's the actual voltage that makes them scale, it's just the heat you generate when pushing more voltage into it. So, yeah. So this is basically why I'm still a bit conflicted whether I want to run this on dry ice. I mean, it's like, if I didn't have the DirectCUII, I would have a much better opinion of this card. Like, this is a great card, it's just that I got some memory chips that are not particularly great, and it's also just like the DirectCUII is just actively better to work with. Like this one has some issues, the DirectCUII does not. Is basically what I'm getting at. But I have to say, I think for beginners, like if you're like new to like overclocking and modding, I think the Lightning is actually better for you because like it does have all of those extra features. It does have those marked volt mod spots, like it is very, very easy to work with. But I think this one, I actually like this one more. Like, yeah, also just because of this, how popular this was for extreme overclocking. I think that prod laser behind the core is actually doing a lot of work. Because like, yeah, like that's the entire output filter, there's nothing on the back. And I like the Lightning just, it doesn't have the can types for like the capacity, but like those with the plus marking, those are pause caps, those are tantalum capacitors. They are very good electrical characteristics. And just in general, how many of them you have, like, yeah, like you don't have a prod laser behind the core. So also you have dual BIOS on the card. Which a DirectCUII doesn't have. Like you have the second BIOS should just be a preloaded cold boot bug fix BIOS, whereas the DirectCUII you first have to find that BIOS if it exists. Like yeah, and it also has like these two switches for like some extreme cooling stuff. I don't exactly know what they do, but it's probably also cold bug related. And just yeah, I would recommend the Lightning to new people. But just consider that just because of how pleasant this was to work with and just how popular this was for extreme overclocking, I think for more experienced people this would actually do a bit better. Though I think even with the Lightning, someone who knows what they're doing with the Lightning could just rip and tear everything. It's just that in the case of my specific cards, the DirectCUII is beating this one. just because like the memory is better and it doesn't really have those mildly annoying issues. And like the core on this one, while being better, is not that much better. Like I ran this at 1.45 volts behind the core. The DirectCUII I ran at 1.37 volts at the VRM. And if the DirectCUII drops that much at the VRM as this, well, I was basically running 1.25 into the core, because this, like at 1.45 behind the core, this is at like over 1.5 at the VRM. So, yeah. So I was running significantly less voltage into the DirectCUII. I was having it colder. I had some very cold water running into the DirectCUII, whereas this was at normal ambient. But like this at 1095 was like 15 megahertz over the maximum I achieved with the DirectCUII. Like the DirectCUII is very close in terms of how good the core is. This one is just very slightly better, and yeah, like while this has a better core, I think the memory can't really make up for that, because I was running this a bit for score, and basically what I noticed is my GPU score pretty much sucks. And I was running higher core than a lot of people that were still beating me, but I was running lower memory than them. So I think when you go into the like 1100 megahertz range, you do actually want to push memory on these, which basically on this is gonna be annoying, whereas on the DirectCUII it's not. I'm just doing something different, completely wrong, and that's why my score sucks. Like I'm getting like 400 points less than everyone else. Most people run like 7,000, I get like 6,600. So I don't really know what I'm doing wrong. Thank you, car on the outside. Yeah, but like undervolting packs a bit more. I also have to say the DirectCUII still has the packs rail completely stock. So if I undervolted on the DirectCUII, the DirectCUII might actually beat this core, because like this does great at like low voltage and stock cooling, but like just because it does great there doesn't mean it has to do great with like high voltage and water cooling or even sub-zero. So yeah. But I think the video should end now. It is getting very long. So yeah, that's just my thoughts about the card and my considerations to maybe or maybe not run it on dry ice. I'm pretty sure the DirectCUII will be run on dry ice. I am still debating whether to run the Lightning. So thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and until next time, goodbye.